Hello, Smart Community friends, and welcome back to Mobility March. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a great follow-up conversation with Ollie Locke, Urbanist and Spacial data scientist, currently finishing up his PhD in Participatory Analytics. You might or might not remember that I spoke to Ollie way back in episode 41 in 2018, back when we were called the Smart City Podcast. We talked then about engaging people with smart cities, and so in this episode, Ollie tells us about his passion for engaging people with how their data is being used. Ollie tells us a bit about how he got into this space and what has changed since he was last on the podcast, before we dive into a great chat about his PhD and key findings from his research into participatory analytics. He tells us what participatory analytics is and how it works to connect the tech, decision makers, and the community, plus a bit about the Civic Labs accelerator program he's currently involved in. We discuss the power of local council relationships with their communities and the possibilities for regional areas since the flea change of people leaving cities post-COVID, as well as the opportunities that now exist for community engagement due to people's willingness to use QR codes for COVID check-ins. We finish up discussing the emerging trends of transformation in transport modelling and not just big data, but also big participation in data. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Ollie. How are you today?
I'm good. It's currently raining in Sydney, so good day to be inside on the podcast.
Excellent. I'm so glad to have you back on the podcast. Now, before we talk about the last time you were on the podcast, let's start with you. Tell us about your background and what you're passionate about.
Okay, so my name's Oliver Locke. I'm currently finishing my PhD at UNSW. I'm in the City Analytics Lab as well as the Expanded Perception and Interaction Centre. And I've been researching the idea of participatory analytics and how that can be applied to how we plan cities, in particularly transport. As well as that, I do a lot of consulting in the data science and spatial data space about how we can best use data to help support decisions in transport planning.
Excellent. And what are you passionate about?
Oh, yeah. I'm passionate about all of those things, in particular, getting people engaged in the way that their data is being used and getting decision support tools out there that really support robust policymaking and robust evidence bases being used in day-to-day lives of planners.
Excellent. Now, last time you were on the podcast, that was episode 41 and was actually in 2018, quite early on in the life of the podcast, which we were called the Smart City Podcast back then. And in that episode, we talked about engaging people with smart cities. Now, you're still working in that space, and not specifically about what we talked about on the podcast, but since 2018 to now, we're in 2020. What have you seen change in this space when it comes to engaging people in the smart community space?
Yeah, so I guess what I've seen a lot of development in the tools that are out there in regards to kind of participatory decision-making, a few more citizen engagement tools. And I think something that has really happened in the last few years is I think there's been a huge increase in people's digital literacy. People are becoming more familiar with using tools like Teams and Miro and all sorts of things professionally and also personally to engage in, how they organize their own lives, but also how they engage with, their community around them and decision makers. And I think that's really good. And we've also seen some huge changes in the way that data is communicated about mobility. We've seen Facebook, Google, all the big tech companies sharing data to people and essentially leading the way in how kind of mobility data is communicated and understood by populations and as a result of the pandemic. And I think, so we've seen this kind of increase in digital literacy, but also increase in mobility data around, which I think is really cool. But one of the things I haven't seen is the validation of that with, people actually uploading their own data. It's all coming from like centralized repositories that's being collected from people.
Okay, well, let's go back to how did you get into this space of, data and smart communities?
Yeah, so I guess it goes back to when I was first started university. I was studying urban planning, and then I found that I was actually quite good at computer science, and then I kind of dug deeper and deeper, and I found that there was this whole kind of treasure trove of research emerging at the time called like urban informatics, community informatics, where it was all about how people, place, and technology connect. And from that, I've always been interested in that space for about maybe even 10 years now, and developing this idea of how we can increasingly connect and improve the environment around us with technology and make stronger communities around us using technology as well.
And what is a smart community to you?
That's a good question. I think a smart community is, a healthy and connected community. Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. Maybe just a more intimate version of a smart city.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the more I ask this question, the more I don't know. I mean, I guess it's a relevant question, but also it's kind of like what you take out of it is what's important, right? And the bits and pieces that you're doing. And if we simplify it enough, then we can make it, I guess, suit what we need it to be at the time. And yeah, it's healthy and it's connected. Do we need more than that? I guess there's, livability, and is it about using data and technology as opposed to just just an approach that we have now? Is it about using new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, or is that just embedded into what we, do already? I don't know. So that's an interesting question.
Yeah. And I think as well, like a lot of the ways we think about technology is we stop thinking of things as technology once it becomes common. So, you think about things like the wheel. That was a technology a long time ago, and now it's just a wheel. It's nothing special. If you think about, typewriters, that was a technology. Microsoft Word was a technology, and these become our kind of common vernacular. I think, yeah, the emphasis reduces on, this being a technology. It's just something that humans do, and I think having that focus away from, specifically technology, but on the kind of outcome of the technology and what it's achieving, whether that is health or connectedness, I think is very important to guide things towards.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Now, we are going to talk a lot about mobility. It's an area that I love. It's an area that you love, and we are in Mobility March, and I'm excited that you will be the final episode of Mobility March. Now, tell us about your PhD, because last time we were on the podcast, you would have been in the early days. Where are you at now, and what are some of your key findings?
Yeah, so I guess earlier on in the PhD, I was really looking at this kind of theory of participatory dashboards. So the idea that a city can be distilled into a set of indicators. These indicators can be put on a display as a certain set of things that are being monitored, and then a decision maker can monitor these things and decide what to do. And I guess it was trying to create like maybe a reframing or a counter narrative to that, saying that, this isn't particularly participatory. It's kind of mechanistic in one way, and it's ignoring a lot of the complexity of what a city is and a lot of the value that people's opinions can bring about the lived experience of the city. So I kind of went on this journey of looking at how we can achieve essentially participatory dashboards across all types of mobility decision making. And later, I changed the term to participatory analytics, because I thought it was more about the process of citizens being involved in analytics than the actual technology itself, the dashboard. So I looked at participatory analytics and how this could be achieved in operational transport planning. So decisions that are made in real time or in kind of like a low time frame, like weeks. Local transport planning, so things that are quite near your neighborhood or near your house, but might not necessarily be big enough for you to be engaged in them, as well as strategic transport planning, which is long-term planning. And essentially, I did a set of experiments where I evaluated a participatory analytics technology and process in each of these different scales. So at operational scale, I looked at how we might be able to read tweets and how tweets might be a valuable way to engage citizens in operational transport planning, where, decisions are made quite frequently. You don't have time to actually get someone to read a survey, fill in a survey, because the decision might not be able to be made in that space of time, getting someone to participate. And what I did was actually harvested a whole bunch of people's tweets about transport performance over time. And then I actually sent them a message asking them, was this a good representative tweet about your actual opinion about transport performance, or was it, completely unrelated? And I also used machine learning techniques to look at the topics and the sentiment of those tweets. And from that result, I actually found that 85% of people that tweeted about transport performance said that their tweet wasn't their best or main opinion about transport, which I thought was quite significant. And they also said they'll prefer a more active form of participation than having their tweets collected. So that was kind of an operational scale. Then at the local scale, I got people during COVID actually to draw where they wanted cycling projects on a map, on a spatial survey. 280 people drew on this spatial map on where they wanted transport to be built in Sydney. They also said which priorities for cycling investment they wanted. And then that went into a weighted index, which used passive data like Strava and older surveys like the census, and essentially combined passive people's data and active people's data with some attribute metrics about the city to come up with like a participatory cycling index, which was then also face validated with the community when they saw the results. And then the third experiment at the strategic scale, we looked at essentially how long-term master planning might involve machine learning. And we used kind of a parametric design process called Urban AI to essentially create a set of predictions about the future of Western Sydney and allow planners to get involved in the co-design of this kind of algorithm and its results, which was quite interesting as well. Yeah, so it's a kind of a quick snapshot.
And you're finished now, right?
Yes.
That's exciting. For the second one, what were your main outcomes of that? Were those two things really different, where you had the active and the passive?
I think it was actually, it's a good question. They actually weren't. And I think what was really good was when you saw areas where things agreed. So we see, for example, a citizen, 10 citizen comments in one corridor for bicycle investment. And you see things like propensity to cycle is high there. There are a few accidents there. There's there was something called dangling nodes, which is where the network stops and starts. And essentially where you see these kind of network level characteristics, these passive data traces and active citizen feedback all in one spot. It's like, here's an issue. And you actually get people, when they make their comment about that spot, to write what the issue is. So it's such a powerful decision support system because you've got everything in one spot, which is, a dashboard, right? You've got all that information in one spot. And it's got even the way to solve it, or one way to solve it. And one example of that in Sydney was the Sydney Harbour Bridge, where a lot of people commented on this, essentially this annoying thing related to the stairs. And a lot of people made that comment. So it's like, look, this is, there's all these little issues coming here. It's a bottleneck, it's a bridge, and people want the stairs to be fixed. And so that kind of approach, I think, is quite valuable. And also it was really good as well to see with the tool that was created, you could select different local government areas and it would show you a heat map of the comments and the scores for those local governments. Because usually when you look at this stuff at a whole metropolitan scale, everything's in the city CBD because it's, because that's where the most stuff is. But when you have this ability to filter for local government, you can actually look at issues particular for that community, which I think is really cool. So when people I was surveying, when I asked them, show me, what community you live in, they got really engaged in their own community and looking at those squares and they could verify that spot is bad, which I thought was great as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and I think super valuable as well. As you were talking, I was thinking about even just having those things in the same spot and one, just validating, okay, yes, this is a real issue for the community. And it's also a known issue that the data's telling us, but then it also matches with the community sentiment. But then you can also see the opposite where, okay, we thought this was a really big issue, but actually the community isn't super engaged on it. And whether it's just because they're not aware of it or, like you said, it may be in a regional town that actually it's a huge issue for a certain percentage of the population, but there's not as many people there, so it doesn't get that reaction or whatever, but just seeing those things as well. And then it kind of can indicate, well, let's go and investigate this and see, what the case may be.
Exactly. And I'm calling this process participatory analytics. And I guess, and what as well was, I thought important was you have this step. So you have active and passive engagement at the start, but you also have like this kind of, I call it active short. And then you have active long later on, where people actually look at the previous active results and the passive results and verify it again. And I think that verification again is important, so people can kind of like upvote or downvote ideas that other people have presented. But you also get those people, you get to have the people that, are super, super busy through passive, are like mildly busy through active short, and like aren't busy at all. Sorry, the other way around. Yeah, super, super busy passive, mildly busy active short, and like not busy at all active long, where, you can get, people to look at that for a long time. And ultimately, this is about building trust in how decisions are made with the community, because they see that, this stuff's being combined together. They see some of the kind of network data being used. They get a chance to have a say, but it also connects decision makers with that as well. And they have trust in the community that they've actually, seen other aspects of that and appreciate, that the kind of scientific stuff that might go into a model or so forth. So it's about connecting this essentially just connecting, technical and community better.
Yeah, no, I really like that, because I think sometimes those things get really disconnected, and not even, a lot of the time, I guess, those things get really disconnected, and the decision makers might not even see, the comments, or they might, or vice versa, where the community hasn't actually seen, they just see, I don't know, one thing saying, oh no, I don't want that here, but the understanding isn't there. So it kind of informs both parties, which I really like. But then people they might still have exactly the same opinion, which is fine. But then, you're allowing them to see, not only engage in that at that moment in time, but then I think that's so valuable. So then they can, like, the timing aspect of it as well, because then so I think people go, oh, I said this ages ago, no one ever listened to me, I'm never going to say anything again. But if you can see that those things have been taken into consideration or are there, I think that's so valuable.
Yeah. So if someone can see that people's comments were carried on through a longer process. And I think something that I think would be even more like valuable going forward is if we can kind of make sure that these comments aren't just cross-sectional, that, we can keep comments and kind of over time and make sure that, like this comment was 5 years ago and, this issue is still there. What's going on?
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, cool. So now you've finished your PhD, you must have so much time on your hands, right? What are you up to now?
Yeah, so I'm kind of enjoying the final months of my PhD. At the moment, I'm doing an accelerator program called Civic Labs, and we're developing a livability index for Victoria, partnering with Delt. So we're about to start developing the minimum viable product, fingers crossed, going through the accelerator process. And actually, now that we mention it, the actual livability index will be going through this participatory analytics approach. So traditionally, when we look at livability, we use these surveys like the Economics Intelligence Unit, which are useful for what they're designed for, which is traditionally for relocating people for corporate purposes to cities and understanding how much essentially money to compensate them for relocating them to a different city. So we think about livability through the lens of, a professional in a particular industry rather than, someone that might be, living, in an outer area, a regional area, or, not a full-time working professional in the financial sector. So we're essentially developing localized livability metrics that actually let us understand what aspects of livability are working well for people, what aspects of livability do people care about, and what kind of first principles livability principles are performing well or not. And we've put that in a framework similar to participatory analytics, which is actions, attributes, and attitudes of people and places.
Yeah, no, it sounds really interesting. And I think we were recently on a mobility panel together for the Smart City Summit. And we talked a little bit about, I guess, the city versus the regional kind of, mobility or livability I guess, how it affects our livability, being in regional areas, etc. Do you have any thoughts on, I guess, like, do you think you have to look at things quite differently when you are collecting data in those different areas? When we were talking about, CBDs, and we've got access to a whole bunch of different things, but then in regional areas as well.
Yeah, so we're talking about, so essentially collecting data as in like community feedback or?
Yeah, community feedback. Is this, like, do you have to consider things differently when we are, I guess, dealing with regional areas and maybe there's not that density of people to really get the, I don't know, whether there is a different approach or whether it's the same approach. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think these ones really rely on the local councils' relationships with the communities they're responsible for. I think, lower populations, I think a lot of the issues will probably be quite well known. And I think, the kind of two aspects, there's kind of community engagement in regards to kind of current issues, and then there's community engagement about like visioning. And I think particularly as these areas are growing, it would be really exciting to see kind of some more public community engagement out visioning, because I think some of these areas are going to grow, these regional areas, because of, I don't know what it is. It's the blue change, there's a green change, and then there's the kind of new COVID regional.
The flea change.
Is it called the flea change?
Yeah.
I think the flea change is probably going to start happening, and it would be really cool if we could start, getting some of the people that are coming in, quickly engaged in these communities and figuring out how they're going to all live together in a new and improved way. I think it's super exciting. And because, these people are working remotely, bringing their CBD jobs with them, it's actually kind of, they're bringing the CBD economy in some way to these areas, which will be great because we'll see all sorts of different businesses pop up, probably younger people start to live out there again, rather than the kind of, regional declines we were seeing because of, decreases in agriculture and so forth.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to, like, we need to really, I guess, respond, or the regional areas need to respond, and even, I guess, with the state and federal levels, just with, bringing our, like, people have money to spend when they're in the CBD jobs, but then what does that do for housing and the people living there already? And so there's so many complexities within that. And even like, can we move to the regions? Can we have our cake and eat it too, and not have traffic and noise and pollution and, all these things that are associated with cities, but can we continue that regional lifestyle? And I don't really have the answer. I think it's a complex issue, but I think working towards that and making sure that the local governments are ready to serve the new population, but also the current population and the existing population as well. And I think, something like, your tool would be an interesting one to see the different thoughts between, like, they're bringing new skill sets as well, which I think is important, and new skill sets that could potentially be applied within local governments, like data analytics, like, data science, and even those things as well. And then also upskill people within different areas, I think it's something that we need to really take advantage of and not just let happen to us in regional areas, for example. But I think it'll be really interesting because something's got to give, and so something's going to shift in that space for sure, particularly in this space. Yeah,
I actually, it's kind of a bit off topic, but during these kind of accelerator programs that I've been exposed to quite a few Australian startups. And I must say there are a lot of companies doing some amazing things to do with data analytics and optimizing farming, all sorts of things with sensors and drones and robots, AI, like doing all this stuff in the regional areas. And I think that would be a really cool connection to connect some of these skills and these startups and bring them out there and kind of really, jumpstart a lot of that, the professions in that area around, farming, and kind of, I think that's some really cool potential there. And it's probably already happening, not even potential.
And I think it is definitely happening, but I think the storytelling element isn't there yet. Like, so, we don't know about it, but there's some amazing things happening in this space. And also, if we can, I guess, grow those sectors, like you said, agriculture was declining, but can we grow them again? Because you actually need different skill sets. You still need the traditional skill sets, but then adding that, well, what tech skill set do I need to be able to maintain this thing or improve this thing or do the analytics side of things? And sometimes, you can use a tool, right? And you just need to know the answer at the end of the day. But you might then hire somebody within your team to continue to improve or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, I think it will be an interesting development over time. But yeah, really, I guess the community being involved in the decisions so then they can shape what that visionary thing that you were talking about earlier. I think that's really, really important.
I think something as well that is a huge change in behaviour is people's, I know this sounds a little strange, but people's willingness to use QR codes, I think, is actually, because of COVID check-ins, I think is a really good opportunity to ask people more questions, because a QR code can activate all sorts of different things. It can activate a survey. It can activate a digital overlay on the environment in front of you, and it can show you a future idea, or it can allow you to vote on it, or allow you to make a comment about a place where that QR code is. And these kind of new digital literacy skills that are kind of emerged from the pandemic, I think are going to provide useful new affordances for people to engage in the world around them.
Yep. No, I totally agree. And I think that's true. And it also then leads to, one thing was, the QR code, but then it also leads to the question of like what other nudges could happen that then would, result in better outcomes for the whole of the community. So we can start thinking about that. We've seen it happen in practice. So what other things could, and obviously that could be taken to a negative as well. So thinking about that's how we get addicted to things and all these type of things as well. But it's like for the community good, what other things could we do? Okay, I want to jump to the future. What are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
The emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough. I really like I think the way that we currently use things like transport modelling is really needs to go under a huge transformation. I think especially here, a lot of the stuff that I was working in like the data science and modelling and analytics space in regards to transport was kind of calibrated to a sequence of years, from the census and all sorts of trends. And I think, and all sorts of approaches that were, have been developed a really long time based on assumptions on how we're going to be in the future, based on data and trend lines of how the future will be. And I think all of that is different now. I think the world is changing very fast. Like we don't have the same modes of travel. We certainly don't think we'll have the same modes of travel in the future. We have like generational values changing, and we have like new data sources. So I think, things like the 4-step transportation model that's used in practice, I think needs to go into more kind of these kind of intricate, detailed, like human-centered agent-based modeling approaches that think about how individuals make decisions and are able to model things like emissions and like EVs and on-demand transport a lot easier because of this kind of rule-based model instead. So I think I would love to see more of these tools out there and being used and being developed. And I think a lot of great technology also was developed from the pandemic because, we use agent-based models to understand how diseases and viruses spread. So I would love to see more of this technology being used for good and for good, sustainable green transport planning. I think, and I said this in the forum as well, I think we talk a lot about big data, but we still need to talk more about big participation and how, we've got a very distracted, and as you said as well, like, a distracted society that can be kind of nudged by behavior through what's shown on their computer screens or their mobile phone screens. How do we use stuff like that for social good? I think I would like to see more about, isn't being talked enough about. Yeah, and how essentially this big data divide as well, like how close are you and how much do you know about the repository of information that is stored about you? And I'm sure, I reckon we only know 0.01% of where our data is. I think there's much more information about us out there than we could ever tell anyone with words. And I think that's incredibly scary. And I think, we need to think about how we can control and verify and approve of how our data is being used more, particularly when, big companies start playing in things like the infrastructure space and big tech start like influencing not only the way like we use our phones, but the way we move around. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to get a better grasp of what's happening there.
Yep, I totally agree. I think it's like the modern version of like, I don't know, Coca-Cola paying for a study on the effects of sugar or something and saying how, oh, well, actually it's not that bad. It does really good things. Like we really need to be.
Gives you more energy.
Gives you more energy and what's the word? Oh, like it's good for inflammation, which keeps you like active or something rather than, you know, the bad side effects that it can have, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think people will start asking more questions about their data, as you said earlier, about our digital literacy increasing, our data literacy increasing as well. And so there have to be some answers for that. And I think we're going to go through some pretty, roller coaster-ish type times in the very near future where we're not sure where we're going to come out or end up at the end, and there won't be one, right answer. So yeah, I think it will be super interesting. So thanks for bringing that up too, because I think it's something we have to continue to think about as well. How can people connect with you?
So the best way to connect with me is my LinkedIn. I'm quite active on there. I believe it's linkedin.com/in/olock. Yeah, so we can talk there.
Excellent. We'll put the link in the show notes so people can click away and find you. Well, Ollie, it's been so great to chat with you today. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and being part of Mobility March.
Thanks for having me.
I look forward to our next conversation. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're looking for support in podcast strategy and production, workshop design and facilitation, or communication and media advisory, get in touch. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.